Welcome, future doctors, to another episode of the Future Minority Doctor podcast with Dr. Zulma
and Marina, where we bring you conversations to empower and inspire you to contribute to your community and the world by becoming a doctor.
Hello, future doctors. I hope that everything's going good. Some of you are maybe going to start college this fall. Some of you are halfway through, and then some of you maybe all are already applying to med school this year. So wherever you are, we wish you a lot of luck. So today's episode will be short but sweet, but I wanted to talk about credit cards. So my niece, she's going to start the pre-med track, and we'll be starting college this year. And we got together and we were talking about a bunch of stuff. And then we then touched on the topic of budgeting, finances, and so forth. And then we started talking about credit cards. She was wondering, is it a good idea or not? Is this something I should go for or not? As I was talking to her, I said, well, there's some pros and cons to this, right? And if you go online and you do your own research, talk to people, there's a lot of controversy about it, right? If you should get one as a college student. Some people will say, no, they're terrible, they're evil. And then you have other people that will say, it might be a good idea for you to get one because you do need to build your credit throughout life, right? And more than anything, let's be realistic. A lot of us need some financial assistance during college because a lot of us do not come from very wealthy families, right? But regardless, making the decision whether we should get a credit card or not can be stressful. And if you are anything like I was, money decisions really stressed me out when I was younger, and a lot of it having to do because I grew up with very limited resources. So on top of that, when you're making these decisions, you also already know, okay, I'm trying to be a doctor, and I know I'm going to owe so much money in loans once I graduate. So I would even say with the students that we do work with in our application coaching program, they do ask these questions because finances are very stressful. They think about the debt. They think about how they're going to make it. So as we're talking to them, we talk about different areas of their life and how they're going to handle this financial debt and so forth. But credit cards is a topic. It is a topic that's talked about. And what's interesting about it, I do listen to podcasts about finances because I'm still, even as old as I am, still growing and learning from it because I didn't know a lot about from it. It wasn't something that was talked about, finances and credit cards and so forth. And it's interesting that our perspective about finances, it really stems from our own psychology of money. Yeah, that's actually, there's a big psychological component when it comes to money. And for each one of us, it's different. And the thing is, we were all exposed to a very different upbringing. And that really does create a psychological foundation about understanding what finance means. And it builds ideas about what money is and debt. And I feel that this is especially important to our minority communities because in the United States, minority groups are the ones who hold the most amount of credit card debt in the country. So this is why I thought it was an important topic to bring up as you guys prepare for these pre-med years or applying to college. I'm curious, Dr. Marina, what was your financial upbringing like? Like, do you think your parents influenced the way that you think about money then, now? I mean, what's your psychology of money?
I think I grew up with what a lot of people would refer to now as a scarcity mindset because we never had enough money, right? I had a family with 2 parents and 5 children. And for a lot of my years growing up, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. And so it was up to my dad to support the whole family financially. And he struggled. I mean, he was a very capable person, but the job market is the job market, right? And so he did real estate for a while, but the real estate market kind of was at a low point. And so he left that. He did, pool repairs for a while. He worked at a blood bank for a while, but it was nothing that was like so lucrative that made so much money that it was a comfortable salary to support a big family. And eventually my mom went back to school and became a teacher, and that helped my family financially. But for a lot of those years growing up, I remember my mom just like pinching pennies. Like she would count everything at the grocery store in her mind of like, okay, like we only have $80 to spend or whatever. And so this is $5 and this is $3. And she would just kind of tally it up. So she knew exactly how much she was spending. And we had to go without a lot of things, right? We didn't have fancy vacations. We had older cars that my dad would fix up. I remember I wanted piano lessons when I was younger because my older brother was taking piano lessons from a lady at church. And my mom said, I can afford one of you, but I can't afford more than that, right? And it was only like $15 a week, which nowadays is nothing, but it was still money, right? And I remember wanting to join the baton twirlers in middle school. It was like the cheer squad sort of thing. And my mom was worried because she was like, well, it's like the baton is $60 and your uniform is like $100. And like, that's a lot of money. Like, I don't really want you to do that. And I had to beg and beg and beg to do it. And luckily I'm stubborn. So I convinced her, and it was a really good experience. But the same thing in high school, like I wanted to do things and they cost money. And it was always like, we have to pinch pennies. You can't get everything you want. And so that definitely helped me to develop a scarcity mindset around money, that like there's never enough and you have to be really careful with money, and you can't spend a lot of money on yourself because what if tomorrow you need something and you don't have the money, right? But my parents did use credit cards, and I remember them using them a lot because we needed things. Like my brothers and I needed clothes when it was back to school time, and we needed certain things like car repairs or food sometimes. And there were periods of time when my dad was unemployed between jobs, and my mom just used credit cards to pay. But that meant that she was one of those people, and my parents were two of those people who had maxed out their credit cards and were in that really difficult position where it was like, okay, we're going to make the minimum payment, but like, we don't know how we're going to pay these off because our income does not support both our living expenses plus our credit card payments. And so that was hard. And my parents actually did file for bankruptcy at one point and went through that process. And when you file for bankruptcy, your debts are forgiven, but you can't have credit cards for a while because credit card lenders they look at your history and they say, you didn't pay back your credit card debt last time, so we're not going to trust you to pay it back this time. And so they had to go through a period of like 5 years where they had very little credit, and then they had to build it back up again. So that's kind of the environment and the experiences that I grew up with.
Yeah, I think with my experience, very similar to yours, it's always like, what if we don't have money? What if we run out? So it was difficult, I think, because in my case, my dad was very unstable because he suffered from alcoholism. So he did a lot of construction jobs, working here. Everything was just temporary. And in those types of jobs, too, it's very weather dependent. So if it rains, you're not going to work, which means you don't get paid, right? So he also did a lot of, he was an agricultural worker too. So the money wasn't always flowing, right?
Yeah.
My mom was the one that was a little bit more stable, but yeah, she was a factory worker. So you can imagine the income from that was very low. But what's interesting, even though we, just like you, we opened up our fridge. We had like the bare essentials in there. We often lived with other families, like where we would rent rooms with our entire families. So it was interesting that even though there was very little resources, they would use the credit cards as like, that's extra money that's always available versus like, actually it's not money that's available because it's expensive money that's available. So they got very used to using credit cards. And I would say that they would not only use it for emergencies or for things that they necessarily needed, but they just wanted. So just watching them, and I would hear them say too, like, you're going to be in debt your whole life anyways. So whatever, it doesn't matter, right? So that was a lot of what like we grew up around. And my parents also had to file for bankruptcy, at some point too, which is also common in minority communities, right? And having to develop their way back and also with the credit. But it was very hard, like, to understand how that can influence you so much as to when I got to college, I was like, oh, I did think about, okay, it's debt, but I was just like, oh, it's normal. You're supposed to have a credit card,
Yeah.
right? Because that's what you just saw your family do, right? So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, very much the similar psychology of money, but just the credit card was like a okay thing to have growing up is what I though saw when it comes specifically to credit cards.
Uh-huh.
Mhm. But anyhow, I wanted to discuss this topic because if you're already in college, you know this, or the ones that are going to start, there's usually these credit card company people on your campus that set up like a little booth and they offer these cool little perks if you sign up for their credit card,
Uh-huh.
which is where I ended up starting the credit card journey. And I did get a credit card the first year when I started college. But,
Mhm.
I never really had anybody sit down and having a discussion with me about what credit cards are, like actually what they work, or, there was just absolutely no guidance, right? And the problem is that, of course, this is just going to add to the debt that you're already going to incur as a
Mhm.
college student, as a medical student.
Yeah.
I was just clueless. I don't know. Did you end up having those people on your campus too, in
Oh
your
yeah.
college?
And
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I did the same thing you did. I signed up for a credit card, at one of those tables, one of those booths, and that's how I ended up with a credit card. And I'll say that like most of us kind of repeat what we learned from our family, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, right? And I definitely fell into the trap my first 2 years of college of just racking up more debt than I could reasonably pay off. And so at some point, my second year, I had to say, okay, like I'm smart enough. I know I'm taking calculus classes and physics classes. Like I can now understand how credit cards work and look at the
Mhm.
math and be like, okay, I'm paying 15% interest or 19% interest on this credit card. So I'm paying 15 to 19% more than the thing that I wanted actually cost if I don't pay them off, right? And of course, the
Mhm.
longer you take to pay off, the more money you're paying. And so, I had to get strict and just buckle down and pay them off. But it was a painful process. And I realized later on that I was like, oh, I was repeating the behavior that I saw my parents have,
Mhm.
right? And it's not that they wanted to go into that, right? Nobody wants to go into debt, but that's just what had happened. And so I unintentionally fell into that trap. But luckily, like midway through college, I was able to figure it out, take a step back, pay off those credit cards, and learn how to still use a credit card, but not use it so much that I wouldn't be able to pay off the balance each month. And so the
Mhm.
habit that I eventually developed was like, yes, I use my credit card in order to develop good credit because that's
Mhm.
important when you want to buy things like a car or a house later on.
Mhm.
But I pay it off every month. Like whatever I charge to my credit card that month, I have to be able to pay it off next month. Right. And that's a healthier habit. But it takes some time to develop that because in college, you have a lot going on and you're
Mhm.
not always paying attention to how much is accumulating on your credit card. And when your friends say, hey, do you want to go out to eat? And it's Friday night, and you really want to be part of that friend group and you really want to have that social
Yeah,
experience, it's really hard to say, oh, I can use my credit card, but I know I won't be able to pay it off. So I'm going to say no. That's really hard to do just
it
from a
is.
social and emotional perspective, but it's like a muscle that you have to exercise, a mental psychological muscle of just learning what your financial limits are and sticking by them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. I think it took me longer to learn that than you. But,
Well, I did slip up later a few times, but it wasn't too terrible.
but
I'll,
yeah,
I'll, I'll confess. Yeah.
I know, yeah. So basically, what we're saying. So, what are the benefits of getting that? Like Dr. Marina said, it will help build up credit, which it really does matter. You do end up needing it in your future, or even when you're in college. If you're going to rent an apartment with some friends that you make throughout college, they run your credit score, right? So,
Yeah.
it does help build up credit. So, it is an important in that sense, right? And I would say the other thing too, it's just nice to know that there's something there in case you have an emergency, right? So that's also reassuring. However, on the flip side, why it's not so good is, as Dr. Marina said, the high interest rates, right? So if you're going to pay something that's $100, and I mean, right now, the interest rates are like 23%, you're going to think about like, well, I'm actually paying $123 for this piece, right? So you're actually, there's a cost to borrow that money unless you pay things off right away.
Yeah.
Right. So you do want to consider that. And the problem is if you have poor self-control, that you end up using it on things that you don't really need. So this is where your need versus want comes in, right? It can get you into a rabbit hole of debt. And the other thing is the behavioral component. You get one, and then it's easier to just keep getting more and more and more and more and more,
Yeah.
which can also hurt your credit as well, right? So if you rack up too much debt, that could also hurt your credit score. So on the flip side, it could be good or bad. So you have to consider those things as well, and whenever you're thinking about it. So here are my tips. First of all, so say you're in college or you're going to start college first, budget with the money you will have, okay? Not the credit card money, but you want to look first to see, okay, how much am I getting from financial aid? Am I going to be working? Some of you might have parents who can contribute, right? So you want to really sit down and think about like, okay, let me see how much money I have coming in. And then what are my debts going to be, right? So you're going to have to pay tuition, right? So you want to look at that. If you have a car and you're going to have to park because there's not good public transportation, or if you're going to do public transportation, what that's going to cost. And then where you're going to live, food expenses. I mean, you're just looking at all your utilities to really budget to see how much you can really afford, okay? You want to really try to avoid having to use a credit card to make these basic ends meet. All right. So then that way you can really rely on the money you actually do have. The other thing too that, as I was telling my niece to this just about 2 weeks ago, I said, when you're on your breaks, work full time. Go get a full-time job and just save a lot of money when you're not in school. Like this is your time to just save that money so that way that's going to be more so your fund, your emergency fund versus having to go to the credit card in case something happens. You won't be able to have the coolest clothes, the coolest makeup. I think you have to go into college knowing that that's just not what it's going to be like. I do believe in your budget. You should set aside some fun money because you do need to go to the movies. You do need to go out with your friends, right? But again, that all comes with budgeting as well. And you will be able to do that if you really sit down to create a budget. So I personally don't think it's bad if you have a credit card or two, just in case you need it for emergencies. And I do think that building credit is important, but I think you really have to reflect about how do I think about money? How do I think about debt to really understand how well of control you're going to have, right? So just take a minute to think about how did my parents handle their money? Do I have their traits? Like if I look back and I have money on hand, what am I doing with it? Am I doing what my parents are doing? Do you feel comfortable with credit card debt? If you're one that is more the type of person that just feels so stressed out about it, well, maybe it might not be because that's just an added stress that you're having on yourself. If you can make it without it, you can. I mean, it really is a very individual and personal decision. And if you do have poor self-control after you reflect, it might not be the right time to get a credit card. Sometimes it might be good for you to wait maybe a year or two. Kind of like when Dr. Marina said it was about after her second year that she realized like kind of the groove of things and what credit cards do and so forth. You might want to just try to live on with the money that you do have for a year or two until you learn what budgeting is like, what living like a college student is like. And then at that point, you might feel more comfortable getting a credit card because you're already set in your ways on how to spend money and not rely on the credit card for extra money as well. All right. And remember, the credit card debt will not be forgiven ever. You have to pay it back. Okay. Educational debt, especially if you're going to be a doctor, because if you're listening to this, you want to be a doctor. You're going to get a lot of medical school debt, but there's loan forgiveness programs. So there's a potential that in the future, all this debt you have that's related with your education, it can be forgiven. Okay, it was forgiven for myself. But your credit card debt will not be forgiven. You will carry that with you forever. Okay?
Yeah.
And I want to be real. I mean, a lot of us first generation college students, we come from, poor backgrounds and we need extra money. So that's why I'm not completely against having a credit card, but just really be careful and think about how you're learning about money, understand yourself about money, and if you can wait at least your first full year so you kind of get the hang of how to live in a low budget lifestyle too before you go and grab one. I wish somebody would have told me that. I wish I could have had this discussion and conversation with someone. I think my approach to debt would have been very, very different.
Oh, yeah,
So,
absolutely. And
yeah.
I might add, so I mentioned earlier that I did sort of figure things out and get my credit under control mostly after my first years of college, but that actually coincided with meeting my husband. And it was him and his family's attitudes towards money that kind of shifted me, because he was kind of horrified at having any credit card debt, and he had grown up in a household where he didn't grow up wealthy or anything, very sort of like middle class, but for his family who had grown up in poverty like in the 40s and 50s, debt was just a terrible thing, and you just paid off any debt as quickly as possible. You never wanted to have any debt, right? And that's actually not completely true, because there are types of debt that are quote unquote good or okay, and types of debt that are worse or bad. And so when he met me and we started to talk about money and he saw that I had some credit card debt, he's the one who kind of motivated me and even helped me a little bit to pay it off. And then we agreed from then on that it was like, we're just not going to have credit card debt. And we got married young, so those financial decisions were being made jointly. And so I'll give him credit and his family credit, because they're the ones who really pushed me more towards that perspective. And without that, I might have gone longer without realizing how bad what I was doing really was. So I will also mention that, like you said, having credit cards can be a good safety net, right? So if your car breaks down and you need like an $800 repair, you don't have $800, it's okay to use a credit card for that, and then just make a plan and budget so that you're going to be able to pay it off in a reasonable time, right? Because emergencies happen to everyone, and credit cards do have a place to help us deal with those emergencies.
Agreed. Well, I hope you guys learned something and you guys give thought to it as you guys start college, or if you're in college or applying to med school. And please feel free to reach out to us on our website, futureminoritydoctor.com, and we'll be happy to answer some questions. And thanks for listening today. Peace and love, everyone.
Till next time.